Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 694 for May 3rd, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
Single malt Scotch whisky is probably the greatest example of craft distillation or craft spirit in the world, and for small batch producers such as ourselves, we feel the challenge is there to show what we can do and what we can bring to the party, if you like.
Paul Miller opened the Eden Mill Brewery in St. Andrews, Scotland back in 2012, just a couple of miles away from golf's birthplace at the Old Course, and he started distilling whiskey 2 years later. A couple of weeks ago, Eden Mill released its Hip Flask series of experimental single malts and will be releasing its first regular single malt Scotch whisky in August. But even though those debut whiskeys are just now hitting the market, Eden Mill is already making plans to move into an even larger distillery and brewery nearby. Paul Miller and head distiller Scott Ferguson will join us later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the calendar of events, your voice, this week's tasting notes, and in our new Behind the Label segment, we'll look at the history behind one of May's classic cocktails. That's all coming up on our midweek episode of WhiskyCast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's start off with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. There's a lot of buzz surrounding the latest celebrity whiskey to hit the market. And yes, we're talking about Bob Dylan's move into the whiskey business with a new line of Heaven's Door whiskies. The Nobel Prize-winning singer and songwriter is working with Mark Buchala's Spirits Investment Partnership on the project. Buchala was part of the team that built Angel's Envy bourbon from the ground up before selling it to Bacardi in 2015. And there are plans for a distillery and visitors center to open in Nashville, Tennessee in 2019. We'll get more details from Mark Buchala on the weekend edition of WhiskyCast, but until then, we do know there will be 3 initial whiskeys in the Heaven's Door range: a Tennessee straight bourbon, a double barrel whiskey that blends 3 different styles of whiskeys with a year's finishing in new casks, and a straight rye whiskey finished in French oak cigar barrels. And just to make it clear from the very start, Bob Dylan is not doing any interviews about the project. Scotland's controversial minimum unit pricing scheme for alcoholic beverages took effect on Tuesday. The government has set a minimum price of 50 pence per unit of alcohol, and that's likely to create some confusion and a few headaches. Thanks to the folks at the online auction house Just Whiskey Limited, we have an easy way to figure out the cheapest legal price for a bottle of whiskey. You multiply the ABV, or bottling strength, by the size of the bottle in centiliters, then divide by 100. Then you multiply that number by 0.5. So let's put it in real-world terms. Take a 70 cl bottle of whiskey that's bottled at 40% ABV. That gets you 2,800, 70 times 40. Divide that by 100, and you get 28 units of alcohol in the bottle. Multiply that by 0.5, and you get the minimum price of 14 pounds. And this means cask strength whiskeys will have a higher minimum price than regular strength whiskeys. By the way, it's not just retailers and bars that will have to comply with the new law. It will also affect whiskey auctions. Just Whiskey Limited is now imposing a starting price on all of its auctions that complies with the new law. There's one bottle of whiskey that would have absolutely no problems complying with the new minimum unit pricing scheme. that will go on display this weekend during the Spirit of Speyside Festival. Of course, it's a very safe bet that this bottle of Glenfarclas from 1920 will never go on sale. Not after managing director John Grant acquired it for the distillery's archives. Deborah Stewart of Glenfarclas picks up the story from there.
It's one of these lovely stories that just comes up every so often, and you think, it can't be true. It's too cute to be true almost, but it definitely is. So what happened, the first we heard about this was at the end of last year when someone contacted us to say, oh, we've found this old bottle of Glenfarclas. Do you want to know more? Are you interested? So, of course, John Grant said, yes, of course, we'd love to know some more. And so between the seller's fat story and what John could establish himself, we realised this bottle actually dates to 1920, and that makes it the oldest unopened bottle of Glenfarclas that still exists, that we know of.
Where was this bottle all these years?
The story that we've managed to piece together is it was given to a Mr. Stephen Dowell, who was the manager of the long-closed Gartluch distillery down Glasgow direction. Now, that distillery actually closed in 1920, so the bottle was given to him as a gift when the distillery was closed to thank him for his work as manager there. He kept it for a long time. It was then passed down through the family, and it was actually his niece who had it until way back in 1988, when it was then given to her son-in-law, Mr. Taylor, that then got in contact with us and said, this could be something interesting. They found it, believe it or not, in the back of the original, the granddaughter of Mr. Dowell, found it in the back of her laundry cupboard, wrapped in a tea towel. And it was only when the granddaughter said, oh, we've got this bottle of whiskey, and the son-in-law said, oh, that could be something of interest, that eventually came to our attention, and they decided they would like it to come back to us if it was of interest to us, and of course it was.
Was Glenfarclas bottling single malt on a regular basis back then, or was the stock going for blending back in 1919?
By far the bigger part of it would be going for blending. That would have been the business back then. But clearly there was at least some going for single malt. But because obviously very small amounts, that's why we don't have anything ourselves. Well, until now we didn't have anything ourselves from that time.
What are you going to do with the bottle? I know it's on display during the festival, right?
It is. Unfortunately, we're not going to keep it on display in the visitor centre because the conditions there really just aren't optimal for a bottle this rare. So we'll risk it over the weekend, but unfortunately it's a bit too warm in the visitor centre. It's a bit too bright. It's not ideal. The bottle's in great condition, but the label's not perfect anymore. We really don't want it to deteriorate any further, so it will be going into a private archive of John Grant's. At
his house, of course, right?
At his house, well, his house, the distillery, it's all the same thing, isn't it?
That's true.
But since he basically lives right next door, so but I'm not sure he'll tell us exactly where he's going to keep it. But it won't be far away, but it will not be on permanent display unless we find a much nicer way to display it, which won't do any damage to it.
And of course, if he decides to get a small syringe and stick it down the side of the cork and pull some out, who's going to know? It's the family's distillery.
He can do that. After all, he could totally do that. And at the end of the day, the level's not quite at full anymore anyway. So what's a little bit more here or there?
The festival runs through Monday all over Speyside. And it's the one weekend when many of the region's distilleries that are normally closed to visitors open up their doors. Take Tamdhu, for instance, which is celebrating its 120th anniversary this year. Ian MacLeod Distillers is opening up Tamdhu this weekend and also has 2 new distillery-exclusive single malts. I tracked down Ian MacLeod's Gordon Dundas at the Tamdhu manager's house.
We've got a single cask, which is celebrating the 120th anniversary, which was selected by the distillery team. That's a 2002 vintage first fill European oak sherry cask, so rich, dark colours that we would expect from that. Superb, high strength at 59% alcohol. So really, really stunning limited release to 603 bottles. And we've also just released today the Dalby Alley Dram, which is the first one for the Speyside Whisky Festival, which is named after the Dalby Alley train station, which is obviously the famous train station at Tamdhu, which was one of the main reasons why the distillery is here. and that is a combination of European oak and American oak sherry casks at cask strength, so 62.1% alcohol. So it's a big punchy one. And all of those, that's 1,000 bottles, and they're all individually numbered as well. So they're two very exciting releases for Tamdhu, and really shows the wonderful sherry credentials that we are now maturing at Tamdhu exclusively in sherry.
Both whiskies are also available through the Tamdhu website. There are plans in the works for a new addition to the Tamdhu core range later this year that will complement the current 10 and 12-year-old single malts, along with the fourth batch of Tamdhu batch strength that's coming soon. And since Duffton is the heart of Speyside, there will likely be a few people nosing around Diageo's Duffton Distillery this weekend. Diageo is giving its Singleton of Duffton range an update with the new Malt Masters selection. It's matured in a combination of European and American oak casks. The rest of the Singleton of Duffton range will be refreshed as well, with replacements coming for the Sunray, Tailfire, and Spey Cascade expressions. Now, if you're in the U.S., you might be wondering, what is this Singleton of Duffton stuff? I've only seen the Singleton of Glendullan. That's because there are 3 different distilleries that supply single malt for the Diageo Singleton lineup. The Singleton of Glenord is sold exclusively in the Asia-Pacific region. The Singleton of Glendullan malts are primarily sold in the U.S., while the Singleton of Duffton is sold pretty much everywhere else, including the U.K. and Canada. Meanwhile, Diageo is also launching a new series of Talisker single malts. The Bodega series will, as you might guess from the name, focus on sherry cask-finished whiskies, and the first release in the series is a 40-year-old Talisker. Only 2,000 bottles will be available. The recommended retail price? Around £2,750 each. That's around $3,730 U.S. at current exchange rates. We're still a few weeks away from Fégile, the Islay Festival of Malt and Music, but Douglas Lang & Company is already out with its Big Pete Fégile 2018 limited edition. 3,000 bottles will be available globally, except in the U.S. for around £50. That's about $68 US each. And while they're celebrating on Islay at the end of May, Tennessee's Chattanooga Whiskey Company will be releasing its 2 latest experimental whiskeys on May 30th at the distillery. They've hinted that these 2 whiskeys will be malts instead of the bourbons they've done in the past. Tickets for the release party go on sale May 11th. And finally, there's a change coming for the U.S. spirits industry's leading trade group. Distilled Spirits Council President and CEO Craig Naz is stepping down at the end of next month. After 2.5 years with the group, he took over at the beginning of 2016 for longtime President and CEO Admiral Peter Cressy. Naz will return to his Washington-based lobbying firm, Washington 2 Advocates. No reason was given for the move. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. There's more to the Highland Park lineup, though, than just the classic 12 and 18-year-old editions. Look for Valkyrie, Full Volume, Magnus, and The Light at a whiskey shop near you. And check out the complete lineup at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Whiskey Live Sydney is next weekend, May 11th and 12th, along with the London Whiskey Weekender, the 11th through the 13th. Also in London, a few tickets are still available for the Whiskey Exchange's Cavalan tasting with Ian Chang. That's at Smith & Walensky in Covent Garden on the 15th. The New York Times is hosting an American spirits tasting and history discussion on the 16th at the American Revolution Institute in Washington, D.C. The Kensington Wine Market in Calgary, Alberta, has its 26th anniversary mini whiskey festival on the 17th. And as we heard last time around, the Oxford Bourbon Festival and Auction is May 18th through the 20th in Oxford, Mississippi. Right now, we have 249 different events around the world, On our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com, there's bound to be one near you.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Coming up in a few minutes, we'll go behind the label and take a look at the history behind the Mint Julep.
The name julep is an adaptation of a Spanish Arabic word, julep. So you add an E to it, which is actually an adaptation of an Arabic word, golab, which literally meant sweet rose water.
Heaven Hill's Lynn House explains the history of Kentucky's native cocktail in a few minutes, and she'll share her own mint julep recipe with us as we go behind the label. WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. The River Eden flows through the Fife countryside to the north of St. Andrews on its way to the North Sea, and at its mouth runs along the hallowed grounds of the St. Andrews Golf Links. Just a bit upstream, it passes the Eden Mill Brewery, which opened in 2012 at the site of the Haig family's Seggie Distillery, which was lost to history back in 1850. Paul Miller and his team added a distillery to the brewery in 2014, and their first single malts are now coming on the market. I talked with Paul Miller and his head distiller, Scott Ferguson, via Skype. Paul, first of all, tell me about the Hip Flask series. This is your first single malt release officially, correct?
Yes, the Hip Flask series was our first single malt release. Essentially, we actually bottled our first single malt, but we're only just releasing it now to the general public. That was a 70cl limited bottling of 300 bottles. But what we wanted to do with the Hip Flask series was we wanted to create a way in which Scotch whisky drinkers could see the difference that small batch distilling could bring to Scotch whisky. We believe that single malt Scotch whisky is probably the greatest example of craft distillation or craft spirit in the world. And for small batch producers such as ourselves, we feel the challenge is there to show what we can do and what we can bring to the party, if you like. So that was the idea behind launching the Hip Flask series.
And you've got 7 of these, right?
Yeah, seven different expressions initially. And what we decided to do was to look at what we thought were special, unique single cask that we had, and put them out as individual single cask bottlings. And then what we will do is ongoing, we will augment these with different casks that we think are special as time goes on. So we'll continue to add to the Hip Flask series.
And this is in advance of your first full-scale single malt that comes out later this year, right?
That's absolutely right. Yes, we'll have our first single malt out from August onwards, and that'll be our 2018 release of single malt.
Let's talk about the distillery now, because you guys have just finished releasing your first whiskeys, and you're already planning a move to a new distillery just because it's not big enough, right?
Yeah, we have the opportunity, if you like, on the site that we're on. It's owned by a really prestigious organization, St. Andrews University, and they are creating or developing this site into a sustainable site. Their aspiration is to be carbon neutral as a university, and they're developing this site to help with that, and they're looking for businesses, industries such as ourselves to be part of it. And they offered us up some space, which coincidentally was right next to where the original distillery was on this site 160 years ago. And we just couldn't turn it down. It's a great opportunity to go in, to increase our capacity and increase the number of visitors that can come and see us. So it's a real win-win for everyone.
Scott, let me bring you in here to talk about these different malts that went into the Hip Flask series, because most distilleries in Scotland, most of the malt whiskey distilleries, don't mess around with a lot of variety in the barleys they use, but that's not the case with you guys, is it?
Yeah, exactly. When we were starting distilling, we were producing fairly small volumes of an average week. And what we wanted to do was take advantage of the kind of small batch size and experiment with different malt types going into the malt bill for each of the washes. So we tried one with about 7.5% chocolate malt going in, and one with about 7.5% split between dark crystal and brown malt, to see what flavour would carry on from distillation all the way through to having it be of age.
And how was it distilling those different malts together? Obviously, you're mixing them together after distillation. Are you doing them separately? Are you doing this as a mash bill? How are you doing it?
It was done as a mash. So instead of, I think at the start we were putting in about 750 kilos of pale barley as the general distillate we were using as the general malt. But we just substituted 50 kilos of the pale for chocolate and brewed the wash from that. And with the brown and crystal malt, it was 25 kilos of each substituted in for pale as well.
So what did that do to your new make spirit? How did it change the taste and the flavor and the aroma?
The first thing you noticed immediately was the aroma coming off the still, especially with the chocolate malt spirit. You got a real kind of powdery, almost cocoa butter kind of thing coming out. And it was exceptionally noticeable during the first part of the spirit cut. The brown and crystal malt was a little bit more subtle, but it added a real kind of chewy, biscuity, kind of almost like a shortcakey cereal note, as opposed to the pure pale spirit, which was really kind of clean, cereal dominant and very almost light barley flavour.
And how did those mature over time for the Hip Flask series?
This is the one that really, really surprised us, that the flavours from the new make spirit persisted really, really well and really, really clear across the 3 and a bit years that they've been maturing in. I mean, it's virgin oak octaves, either European or American virgin oak. So we thought the cask was going to be really dominant, but the finished product really carries a lot of flavour from the malt and it's really deepened over time. The chocolate malt spirit in particular carries a real powerful, almost kind of chewy, viscous, cocoa kind of flavour that is really, for me, is quite unusual to find in Scotch whisky.
Paul, let me get you back in there for a second. These experiments have sort of gotten you in a little bit crosswise with the watchdogs at the Scotch Whisky Association, haven't they?
Yeah, I think it's maybe blown a little bit out of proportion. I mean, we have we have a great respect for the Scotch Whisky Association, and they do a great job at keeping us on the straight and narrow, let's say, and protecting our protecting the reputation of Scotch whisky. But yeah, I think there's some simple, language, I guess, that they use, which can sometimes be a little bit inhibiting and a little bit put you off a wee bit from maybe trying to experiment and try things differently. And when they say things like, you can't do that if it will change the flavor significantly, then it makes you, very, very wary of being too experimental. But I would say that these products don't change the flavor profile any more than maturing in a strong wine cask or, maturing in a PX sherry cask. These things all change the flavor profile of the spirit significantly. So I think the fact is the rules are, I think there's enough flexibility in the rules, really. It's just the way sometimes these guys choose to interpret them. And that was my concern. The irony here is that when we were initially considering using chocolate malt and crystal malt and all these fun things, it was actually Charlie MacLean, who's one of the more prominent whiskey writers, who actually in our distillery recommended this was a route that could be quite a lot of fun. So, here's one of the foremost whiskey writers suggesting we do something that the SWA were saying, we're not sure this is right, that you should be doing this. Yeah, it was an interesting one. And I think we've got the balance right. I think we've got fantastic spirit, but it is definitely still single malt Scotch whisky.
It's okay to do a little bit of crystal malt or chocolate malt, but not to go overboard, I guess, is the way they're saying it.
I think that's absolutely right, actually. And, we have probably one out of the Hip Flask series, which is maybe, probably pushing the boundaries a little bit. But I'm not sure anyone's going to come back and say, hey, this isn't Scotch whisky, because it definitely is.
Why did you decide to set up the distillery in the first place? What's your background? And give me the Eden Mill origin story here.
Okay, there's a fantastic story, because it actually links very closely to the most bizarre origin, actually. I've been in the alcohol industry 37 years and worked in all different variety of companies. But one of the ones I worked in for some time was working for a guy called Pete Coors, who owns the biggest brewery in the world over there in Golden in Colorado. Now, when I was working for Pete, he brought over his American distributors to play golf on our wonderful St. Andrews Old Course. And 3 o'clock in the morning, there we were in the 4th floor bar, overlooking the 17th hole at St. Andrews. And Pete said to me, tomorrow I don't want to play golf, Paul. Take me to the nearest brewery or distillery. And I couldn't for the life of me think where the nearest brewery or distillery was to St. Andrews, which just, he was amazed at this. And I thought, that just feels like something that would be really, really exciting to do. So the next day I went about looking for somewhere where I could actually make a brewery or make a distillery, and I realized why there wasn't any, and that was because nobody would give you planning permission, nobody would give you any kind of ground or anything to anywhere near St. Andrews. So a couple of years later, we came across this amazing old industrial site 3 miles to the west of St. Andrews, and we basically arm wrestled the university into letting us in to start as a little brewery. And then 2 years later, we started distilling. And they had always said that at some point they would want us as part of their big plan for the site. And now's the time when we're, expanding and building the bigger distillery and, very much part of the plans on this site. So it's fantastic because we've been able to develop something from nothing. We've created, over 50 jobs, and we're adding to what I think this great town in St. Andrews has got to offer. So it's been a really interesting journey, and one that I think we're quite proud of.
And where did you wind up taking Pete Coors to that day?
Well, I gave him the choice of Edredar Distillery or Tullibardine, and in the end, he actually had to see a chiropractor, so we didn't go to either of them.
Tullibardine's not anywhere near St. Andrews.
That was my point. They're both over an hour away. And that was exactly the point. When I worked at Glenmorangie, I was lucky enough to work at Glenmorangie when they were embarking on the original wood finish series back in the mid-1990s. And then when we bought Ardbeg in the late 1990s. And it's one of those things, Mark, that used to really frustrate me was I had to fly over to Islay, and I had to drive 4 hours all the way up to Tain to take my customers to see our distilleries. And of course, I always thought then myself, why don't we have distilleries near where people are in Scotland? It would be really nice to do that. So in the end, we've been very lucky with this. And it's great because we get so many people from all around the world. Over 60 nationalities have visited us, more than I thought there were countries in the world, to be honest. It's a great location for us.
Now, there's a race, and I think you guys have won it now with the Hip Flask series between you and your neighbors up the road at Kingsbarns to release a single malt, because I think they're starting to release theirs, I think, later this year as well.
Yeah. Yes. I
don't want you to talk too much about the competition, but they are in the neighborhood.
Yeah, no, Kingsbarns have done a great job. It's a fantastic distillery. It's more in the more classic Scotch mold than we are. We're a little bit more of a kind of, kind of crafted, kind of, maybe a little bit more kind of innovative and trying new things. And, our team are quite a young team and maybe more in the mold like your American craft distilleries, actually. Whereas Kingsbarns is more your contemporary kind of, or your traditional rather, type of Scotch distillery. We're maybe a wee bit more disruptive. So I think we both give something different, if you like, for visitors coming to the area. And for us, the innovation part came around with the 20 centilitre bottles, because we had a limited amount of whiskey and we wanted it to go as far as we could. And we wanted to get to as many drinkers as we could with the Hip Flask series. So we went with the 20 centilitre bottles, which I think there's maybe only one or two other companies have ever used 20 cl for single cask whiskies. So we think that was quite exciting, quite innovative. And, being able to come up with new and interesting things for whiskey drinkers is something that we're all about. And that's a wee bit different to the traditional kind of Scotch whisky distillery.
And those 20 cl bottles fit really nicely into a golf bag, don't they?
Yeah, you've got it. Exactly. Yeah, the Hip Flask series works perfectly for that.
What's next after the first single malt this fall?
Okay, so we'll have a release of 3 more of the Hip Flask series later this year with some really interesting casks that we've identified. We'll have a release next year. We'll have 2 seasonal releases of single malt. Unfortunately, we don't have vast quantities of stock at the moment that we're able to get out there for whiskey drinkers. So, we'll spend a bit of time identifying the right casks and making sure that we every quarter or so we have 3 or 4 new Hip Flask series that we'll be releasing. And I say a couple of times next year we will have releases of individual single malt batches that we'll have. We're also very, very excited about blending. And one of the things, we actually have more distillers per litre of alcohol that we produce than any other distillery in Scotland. And one of the things that the guys are really passionate about, the distilling team, is blending and creating really, really good blended whiskey. And we're working on a few things for our Art of the Blend series there for next year as well. So we've got some, I think, 3 very exciting ones in the pipeline there. So it's fantastic for us getting Eden Mill on the roadmap for whiskey now, where previously a lot of people know our gin very well, and so it's terrific now to be at the stage we're at.
Scott, let me get you back in here for a second. What's your background? How did you wind up at Eden Mill?
So my background initially was related to the whiskey industry by way of general whiskey sales, working in a whiskey shop while I was studying a completely unrelated field, was studying physics. And it just so happened that after graduating, I was visiting some friends in St Andrews and found out that there was a new brewery that had just opened up, and thought, I'll stop by, see if there's a chance to have a look around, just for interest's sake. And happened to align at the perfect time that there was a little bit of staff holiday time. If I wanted a little bit of a trial shift, it'd be fantastic to have an extra pair of hands. And started from there. After that week, I stayed on, started as an assistant brewer, and I've just been with the company ever since.
So you went from physics to distilling?
Yep. After I started studying at Heriot-Watt, because they do the brewing and distilling kind of postgraduate course at the ICBD,
right,
which is a phenomenal course for kind of linking a lot of the physical sciences together and focusing purely on applied for brewing and distilling. And I was studying that as I was learning initially brewing and then going on to distilling when we got our stills in 2014. And it's really been able to learn from both sides of the kind of academic and practical parts of the industry.
So how do you apply quantum physics to whiskey?
Generally, probably best way is it's a lot of rational thinking, planning as best you can, and then working around any problems that can arise.
Does whiskey make quantum physics easier to understand?
For me, yes, I would say so. I guess that depends on who's drinking the whiskey.
A lot of whiskey in my case, I think.
Thanks to Paul Miller and Scott Ferguson of Eden Mill Distillery for spending some time with us. There's a link to the Eden Mill website in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. And that's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic 16-year-old, the Distiller's Edition, and the new 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. And find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you, as always, by Heaven Hill Distillery. And let's start off with a 2004 Old Pulteney single cask bottled exclusively for the Whiskey Exchange. This first fill ex-sherry butt was bottled at 62.1% ABV. That's a bit of a whopper. And the nose has notes of raisin bread, applesauce, brown sugar, a hint of salted caramel, and dark chocolate. The taste is thick and aggressive with notes of Christmas cake, toffee, clove, raisins, and just a touch of almonds. That high ABV might tempt you to add a bit of water, and if you do, that'll open up fruity notes of apricot jam and orange peel. The finish has long-lasting spices, dark fruits, and touches of chocolate, mint leaves, salted caramel, and raisins. I'm scoring this 2004 Old Pulteney single cask bottling for the Whiskey Exchange a 93. Next up, let's look at the Bowmore 26-year-old single malt from the Vintners series. This one spent the first 13 years in ex-bourbon casks and the final 13 years in French oak wine barriques. It's bottled at 48.7% ABV, and the nose has notes of baked cherries, blackberry jam, a soft smokiness, a hint of menthol, and toasted raisin bread. The taste is woody, smoky, and fruity, with a good balance and notes of baking chocolate, berry cobbler, and a hint of cherry pie for a robust and juicy taste. The finish has a lingering fruitiness and a touch of smoke, along with a touch of wet beach sand. I'm scoring the Bowmore 26-year-old Vintners Series single malt a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, makers of Bernheim Wheat Whiskey, the first new style of American whiskey to be introduced since Prohibition. Aged for 7 years in traditional open rickhouses, Bernheim's mellow taste is refreshingly smooth. Learn more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. I had the chance to taste 2 of the newest vintage releases from Balblair the other night. The second release of the Balblair 2000 vintage spent 13 years in ex-bourbon casks and the final 5 years in Spanish oak ex-sherry butts. It's bottled at 46% ABV, and the nose is well-rounded and complex with mango, pineapple, a touch of Christmas cake, and just a bit of apple pie. The taste has a great balance of oak tannins and spices starting off, with a nice complex background of citrus fruits, honey, and brown sugar. The finish is long and mouth-watering with fading fruits and a touch of cocoa powder. I'm scoring the Balblair 2000 second release a 93. Now, the Balblair 1991 is in its third release, and each release is a bit different from the earlier ones. This edition spent 24 years in ex-bourbon casks and the final 3 years in first-fill Spanish oak ex-sherry butts. The nose is fruity with citrus, apricots, and a touch of peaches, balanced by subtle hints of honey and toffee, along with muted spices. The taste is fruity with a nice spiciness and touches of chocolate, vanilla, and honey in the background. And a touch of toasted coconut comes out on the finish, along with vanilla and citrus notes. It's another excellent whiskey, and I'm scoring the Balblair 1991 third release a 93. I've added these tasting notes to our searchable list at whiskycast.com. Right now, you'll find my tasting notes for 2,152 different whiskeys.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch Whisky, from this place and these places in that place. These are the people that make it, aging in oak for 12 long years. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whisky all shape how bloody good it tastes. Bold as it is complex, for every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up. Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whisky, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. Tuesday, Buffalo Trace announced plans to start boat tours from the distillery's dock on the Kentucky River in a partnership with Canoe Kentucky. They'll be using a 28-foot skiff that carries 18 people, but the boat does not have a name yet. Officially, they're holding a competition among distillery employees to come up with 4 finalists for a public vote to be held on Canoe Kentucky's Facebook page. But that doesn't mean we can't help them out a bit. I suggested on Twitter Tuesday that we should come up with a few names of our own. My humble suggestion, in the spirit of that British scientific ship that needed a name recently, Whiskey McWhiskeyface. Jason Horn chipped in with an idea that combines bourbon with Gilbert and Sullivan, the HMS Pappy 4. And Curtis Grant added this idea: if you're thinking of more than one boat, you could call it Bourbon Fleet. Scott Rittenbaugh at Love Them Stillers on Twitter clearly is overthinking it a bit. Mark, if I had to guess, I think they will name the boat after Commodore Richard Taylor, E.H. Taylor's great-grandfather. He served in the Navy, and his home is on the Buffalo Trace property. Too serious, Scott. Let the marketing folks come up with the serious ideas. Our job is to have some fun with this. So if you have any ideas, share them with us on Twitter, and we'll make sure the folks at Buffalo Trace see them. They may not do anything with them, but we'll make sure they see them. Rhonda Moore of Ottawa, Ontario, asked a question for a friend on Twitter. I need your opinion, please. What is the best bourbon bar in New York City? Asking for a friend at Zach DeLong, who is organizing a New York-based bourbon-flavored birthday party there in June. Well, there are a lot of good options, but you can't go wrong with the Brandy Library, the Flatiron Room, or American Whiskey. But it is New York City, after all, and there are great bars all over the place. Our pal Matt Jones at Whiskey Chef of Beam Suntory also suggested Char No. 4 in Brooklyn, but it appears that Char No. 4 has closed up, which is very, very sad. We can, though, happily report that Ward 3 in Tribeca is back open again. It had been closed for about a year or so because of construction on the building. The Whiskey Leprechaun, the cousin to the Whiskey Fairy, delivered a bottle of the new Jameson 18 Bow Street on Tuesday, and after I posted the ritual photo on social media, H. Hemphill at Bunkai H on Twitter added this comment to our discussion. Jameson Black Barrel makes an outstanding hot toddy, which my spouse likes. Me? Kind of see it as a waste of good whiskey, emoji crying face, but each to their own tastes. Sláinte. Geez, there's an easy solution to this. Get her own bottle of Black Barrel, and that solves any guilt issues that you might have. And in that response, I added the hashtag win-win situation. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com or track us down on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. You can email us too. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Now, let's wrap things up with our newest feature. Behind the Label focuses on things that might help you enjoy whiskey more, or just win a bar bet. We look at some of whiskey's history, science, and other areas. And with the Kentucky Derby coming up this weekend at Churchill Downs in Louisville, the Mint Julep is as much of a Derby tradition as fancy hats and upset winners. And because of its association with what we'll charitably describe as a somewhat rowdy Churchill Downs infield, a lot of whiskey lovers don't take the cocktail itself very seriously. Lynn House is the national brand educator for Heaven Hill and works with bartenders all over the U.S. And she told me the Mint Julep's roots go back almost as far as whiskey itself.
So the Mint Julep's history, actually, a lot of people are unaware, goes back to Arabic culture. The name julep is an adaptation of a Spanish Arabic word, julep. So you add an E to it, which is actually an adaptation of an Arabic word, golab, which literally meant sweet rose water. So julep simply means it's a sweetened drink. is the technicality. So, and juleps were actually originally created as medicine. So it was like muddling of herbs, predominantly mint, sugar, adding a little bit of spirit to it. There's a lot of documentation going back to the 1800s and such, which talks about the fact that if you had a stomach ailment or digestion issues, that you would create this julep for yourself, this spirited julep, to alleviate those issues. It was also consumed as a pick-me-up as well. So if you were kind of feeling, just run down, you could drink a julep, and it would pick you up. So it's all medicine.
Yeah, so it's all medicine. It's all for medicinal use, of course. But
absolutely.
How did we wind up getting it associated with bourbon and with Kentucky and the Derby?
It's kind of been a progressive evolution. So if you look back at julep recipes, you could have used any base spirit. Some of the most popular were brandy, or gin, or whiskey, champagne, claret. In fact, if you look at Jerry Thomas's book, his famous book, The Bon Vivant, he actually describes 5 different types of julep, whiskey being one of them. We really kind of have Senator Henry Clay, who was a senator from Kentucky. And of course, in Kentucky, a lot of bourbon was being consumed there, a lot of whiskey. So typically in that part of the country, the juleps they were drinking were whiskey-based juleps. And when he was elected to Senate, he brings this cocktail to restaurants around in Congress, and it takes off. The Mint Julep actually doesn't become the official cocktail of the Kentucky Derby until much later, like 1938 is the year when it becomes the official cocktail of the Derby. So it's been progressive.
Let's acknowledge, though, that the mint juleps they're serving out of the machine or whatever in the infield of Churchill Downs is probably not the best example we can think of a real mint julep. Is that fair to say?
I think that would be fair to say. I think anything you enjoy out of a machine is probably not the best way to enjoy something. Obviously that's for volume. When you can have it made fresh with great ingredients, really great fresh ice, shaved, the way they originally were served, that's truly the best way to enjoy a proper mint julep.
So how are you going to enjoy one on Derby Day?
My recipe is, I have a very just classic old school recipe. I like to use powdered sugar, and I use about a teaspoon and a half. I don't like mine as necessarily as sweet personally, some people do. You can do so anywhere between 1 to 2 teaspoons of powdered sugar. Add a little bit of water to that, and then a handful of mint, just really beautiful mint. I always make sure to take the stems off because the stems have a little bit of a woody character, and to make sure not to throw any bruised leaves in there because that will actually make that cocktail bitter. And you just muddle it till the sugar dissolves and the oils from the mint leaves are released. And then I top that with my shaved ice, and then I pour the bourbon over it, about 2.5 ounces of bourbon. And I give it a nice stir until it all, the glass gets really nice and frosty. Top it off with a little more ice. And then, as I like to say, get just a fresh sprig of mint and delicately discipline it. So give it a nice little smack to release those oils and put that in as a garnish. So as you're going into the glass, you've got that great aromas hitting your nose, and the bourbon is nice and cold, and the mint and the sugar are all, integrated, and it's delicious. And that's what I will be doing.
If you didn't get a chance to write Lynn's recipe down, relax. We've posted it on the cocktail collection page at whiskycast.com, along with Lynn's recipe for the Dandy, which is a variation on another classic cocktail, the Boulevardier. If you have a question you'd like us to dig into for Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com and get in touch with us. Of course, that's also where you'll find links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD videos, the latest whiskey news, events, my tasting notes, photos, and much more, including a complete archive of past episodes. Our cask strength conversation continues online all week long. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast, and our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.